Welcome to episode 6 of Profiling Key Figures in the Biblical Womanhood Movement. Today I am profiling Edith Schaeffer. Edith Schaeffer is, of course, best known for being the wife of Francis Schaeffer, who was a post fundamentalist conservative evangelical who was active in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Together, Edith and Francis Schaeffer founded L'Abri, a Christian community that was located in Switzerland where they were placed as missionaries. Edith's biggest contribution to the biblical womanhood movement was through her 1971 book, The Hidden Art of Homemaking: Creative Ideas for Enriching Everyday Life. Now, The Hidden Art of Homemaking was not Edith Schaeffer's first book. She made her debut as an author in 1969 with her book L'Abri, which was just a biography of their family ministry in Switzerland. Francis Schaeffer had already by this time published several books for the American market. So between Francis Schaeffer and L'Abri and Edith Schaeffer's book about L'Abri, the Schaeffers had by this point already become household names for Christian America. People associated Francis Schaeffer with these intellectual sparring matches that he would get into about secular humanism and postmodernism, but they mostly associated Edith with this concept that Rosaria Butterfield would later call radical hospitality. Because the Schaeffer's ministry model was really to just simply exist in this beautiful, picturesque Swiss Alps environment in this Swiss chalet and simply wait for people to come to them. And they had an open door policy, so anybody who came was welcome to stay for as long as they wanted to and learn about Christianity from the Schaeffers. I don't think that Edith Schaeffer intended to inspire the biblical womanhood movement or inspire a renaissance of so called traditional womanhood. The Hidden Art of Homemaking is really not a biblical womanhood manifesto, nor is it really even about homemaking. But she had already earned this reputation as being the homemaker par excellence, who was so competent in household management that she could confidently open her doors to the whole world, and in so doing, extend her Christian influence without ever leaving home. And this would make her a big inspiration to later writers, including Mary Pride and Dorothy Patterson, who felt that a woman should devote herself to domestic life and make homemaking a career. Getting into the actual text of The Hidden Art of Homemaking, there's nothing actually very wrong with this book. The thesis is fine. She kind of makes her vision statement in a chapter called What is Hidden Art? And this is what she says. I would define hidden art as the art which is found in the minor areas of life. By minor, I mean what is involved in the everyday of anyone's life rather than his career or profession. Each person, I believe, has some talent which is unfulfilled in some hidden area of his being and which could be expressed and developed. And she goes on to connect this idea with the Christian faith. Quote, a Christian, above all people, should live artistically, aesthetically, and creatively. If we have been created in the image of an artist, then we should look for expressions of artistry and be sensitive to beauty, responsive to what has been created for our appreciation. This was a core value for the Schaeffers. They believed that Christians should engage with and promote the arts. The rest of the book is organized by art form. There's a chapter on the visual arts, a chapter on music, a chapter on drama. And her message is that art does not have to be this big public spectacle or some kind of a production. It's something that we can enjoy in our everyday lives. We can develop our talents and share them with our friends and family. So she's taking something that might be considered kind of lofty and unattainable, and she's saying, no, we can bring this down to earth. We can enjoy this in our everyday lives. But alongside bringing the fine arts into everyday, ordinary life, she also has this program of elevating what we might call the domestic arts. So she has a chapter on interior decorating, a chapter on flower arranging, a chapter on cooking. And she's saying these things can be art too. As you can see from those quotes, this is not being presented in the text as a particularly gendered idea. So, how does Edith Schaeffer become a poster child for gender stereotypes and rigid gender roles? Part of this is the marketing of the book. From a publisher standpoint, they just want to sell books. And the way that you sell a book written by a woman, especially in 1971, is to market it to other women. And whether it should be or not, The Hidden Art of Homemaking is a very female coded title. It signals this is a book for the ladies, and that is how it was received by the market. But the second part of it has to do with how this concept of hiddenness is going to play with a very old concept of separate spheres. So, going back to the Greco Roman world, there was this teaching that the genders were supposed to inhabit separate spheres. Men were suited for the public sphere, especially the public sphere of politics, and women were suited for the private sphere. Now, before the 19th century, it was pretty much accepted by everybody that the public sphere was elevated above the private sphere. And the reason why women were only suited for the private sphere was because they were inferior to men and they could only be trusted with the small decisions of household management. When the biblical manhood and womanhood movement came along, their message was that men and women are equal in worth but different in role. And the difference revolved around this role of leadership for men and submission for women. They wanted to keep the idea of separate spheres, but they wanted to leave behind this idea that the private sphere was inferior and that women belonged there because they were inferior. To put it kind of cynically, part of the strategy of the biblical manhood and womanhood movement has always been to promote women being resigned to the private sphere by romanticizing domestic life. And Edith Schaeffer's message of hidden art, when applied exclusively to women, harmonized really nicely with that goal. It is actually deeply ironic that Edith Schaeffer's life would be interpreted as this model of ideal traditional womanhood, because at no point was her life traditional or even really conventional. She was a second generation missionary. Her parents were part of the China Inland Mission in the early 20th century, so she spent part of her early childhood in China. Now, during the early 20th century, there was a huge emphasis on mission work. And the expression that that took sometimes was that mission work would take priority over family obligations. It was becoming a common practice for missionary parents to put their children in these special missionary schools. Edith's parents did place her older brother John in a missionary boarding school, but Edith herself did live with her parents in China during their time there. However, according to Frankie Schaeffer's book, Crazy for God, Edith was looked after a lot of the time by Chinese nannies. So, as a young child, Edith would not have received the kind of undivided maternal attention that was preached by women like Mary Pride and Dorothy Patterson. And of course, Labrie was anything but a conventional household. Labrie started small. Its first visitors were simply classmates of the Schaefer's children, but it started to really expand in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of that had to do with just the restless mood of the younger generation at this time, which would have been the baby boomers. This was a time for questioning the status quo and for looking for alternative ways of understanding the world and alternative ways of doing life. A lot of these young people took their quest for meaning on the road and traveled internationally, whether as students or just maybe backpacking or hiking through Europe or anywhere else. And these were the kinds of people who started to show up at L'Abri in the 60s and 70s. So, suffice to say, they were not attracting the white picket fence crowd, and L'Abri was not a white picket fence home. As time went on, the Schaefers really had to get creative to make this whole thing work. So they set up a system where long term visitors would work doing manual labor, upkeep of the property and the house for half of the day, and then half of the day would be reserved for study and quiet contemplation. And here's where I'm going with this. Labrie did not function on a principle of strict gender roles. Edith and the other women who were staying there were not doing all of the laundry and the cooking and the house cleaning so that the men would be free to spend their entire day studying and thinking about big, important public matters. Everyone was required to pitch in with household tasks, but everyone was also entitled to this significant block of time that was for their own intellectual and spiritual development. So, Edith Schaeffer really was not a homemaker. She was the facilitator of a very large scale communal living facility that actually ran on very gender egalitarian lines. Part of what made Edith Schaeffer such an attractive poster child for the biblical womanhood movement was that she really seems to be the woman who had it all. She was this domestic goddess, but she was also very cultured and well read. She knew her way around an art museum as well as she knew her way around a kitchen. And the biblical womanhood movement desperately wanted to believe that this was the kind of woman that their program was going to produce charming, confident women with a high level of personal fulfillment who would prove that male leadership was not stifling or oppressive. And Edith Schaeffer was a very cultured woman. Everyone who met her came away talking about how well informed and refined she was. But her life was predicated on this very non traditional model for living that allowed women to get away from domestic responsibilities for long enough to really make an investment in their own intellectual lives. And that was really only possible because the domestic labor was shared equally between men and women. The biblical womanhood movement expected Edith Schaeffer's without Labrie, which is a little bit like expecting people to make bricks without straw.